To join a number of my shadow cabinet colleagues. Victoria is in desperate need of fresh leadership, and as a team we're offering Victoria the state per day $15 million and growing than any other state in the country. We've had a government, doesn't matter who's in charge, but a government that has leapt from one crisis to another, one corruption report to another, one botched project to another, off the back of the Commonwealth Games only a few months back. As a team, today I can outline a refreshed team, given the departure of Matt Bark, but also the change in the Labor leadership. I'm very pleased to be able to say that a number of my colleagues, who will say a few things in a moment about their challenges in their portfolio that they'll be focusing on behalf of Victorians, but have seen a number of them elevated. We see Evan Mulholland, the new Deputy Leader in the Upper House, will take on home ownership and housing affordability with a focus on outer suburban growth. And what I will say about our growth corridors and the outer suburbs is that they are at risk of being completely neglected by the Labor government's approach to planning and housing. It's clear that Labor is going to focus obsessively on the inner city, which obviously needs the investment required, but at the expense of the development and the infrastructure that we need in our growth corridors and outer suburbs, and also in Victoria's regions and rural precincts, which are going to miss out under the approach that Labor is proposing to introduce, and what we saw recently with their proposal to strip local communities of their planning powers. Just running through a few of the key changes. I've mentioned Evan Mulholland already. We see Jess Wilson will take on early childhood, primary and secondary education, in addition to her shadow finance portfolio and also the economic reform program that she's championing. She'll do some great work in that area, and I know that she'll focus, as she'll say in a moment, on the Labor government's botched schools tax and the impact that's having on Victorian families right across our state. We see Cindy McLeish will take on additional duties with work cover and TAC. Bridget Valance will take on tertiary education with a laser-like focus on the skills and workforce crisis that our state faces. Sure, it's a challenge around the world, but this state has made it worse, and we know that many sectors are struggling for people, whether it be in the skills sector or those with the relevant tertiary qualifications to meet workforce needs. Roma Britnell will take on child protection, which we know from the work that her predecessor Matt Bark did is in a state of utter crisis, and we know that there are tragedies occurring in our child protection system with children dying unnecessarily and avoidably. So Roma will take on that. I can also say that in relation to former leader Matthew Guy, I'm very pleased to be able to announce that he makes a return to Shadow Cabinet, and in an area that we all know, you all know Matthew, and you know one of his great passions is public transport, particularly trains, but public transport generally. And he will have a focus on the whole state, not just inner Melbourne, where obviously a lot of our infrastructure is located. He'll say a few things shortly, but I'm very pleased that he has joined the team. I can also say that Deputy Leader David Southwick will take on some additional responsibilities with an overarching responsibility across cost of living. It's going to be a focus, obviously, that we'll be elevating, and David, as Deputy Leader, will work with the economic team of which he's a part to make sure that is front and centre in everything we do. No distractions. We will focus completely on the priorities of the Victorian people, from cost of living, energy reliability and security, which I can also say David Davis will take on. A shadow Special Minister of State will move to David Hodgett, a former leader. But David Davis has worked strenuously in the Upper House. You've seen the number of private members' bills that he's produced over recent months in the integrity space. His energy will be focused now on the risks to Victoria's energy system and supply and affordability in Victoria, so he'll take on that. I can also advise that Leader of Opposition Business in the Lower House, James Newbury, is going to have added to his shadow portfolio's planning, and we know that there are enormous challenges across the planning system which the government has not only exacerbated but will make even worse by stripping local communities of the powers we believe they should have to have influences over the course of their local communities. We don't believe it's fair on local communities that they should be stripped of all voices that they might have to be able to speak on issues that are important to them. So I don't think I've missed anybody out at this point, and I think I will call on, say, Jess, do you want to kick us off with some of your thoughts?
Well, thanks very much, John, and very excited today to take on the Early Childhood and Education portfolio. Must pay tribute to Matt Bark, who has done great work in this portfolio and is leaving big shoes to fill. But from our perspective, we want to make sure that every Victorian child has the best start, and education is crucial to that. We'll be looking at a number of key priorities straight off the bat, including looking at how we do actually return to looking at numeracy and literacy. 1 in 3 Victorian students aren't meeting the required standards under the recent NAPLAN results, and we have to change the equation there. We have to make sure that Victorian students are getting the very best start. Of course, the schools tax, it's an attack on choice. It's an attack on parents to choose where they want to send their kids to school and to a school that reflects their values and their faith. We'll continue our campaign to see that tax repealed, to make sure that the government pulls back on this tax that is hurting Victorian families and pushing up school fees. And just finally, around the teacher shortages that is really crippling our schools. We actually want to focus on how do we retain teachers. We've seen 1 in 5 teachers within their first 5 years in education decide to leave the profession. The government is focusing on how do we bring new teachers in. We actually want to make sure we're also looking at how do we make sure we give teachers that are there now that they feel valued and they get the required professional development to make sure they stay in the system and they continue to teach. So a lot of work to do in this portfolio, but very excited to take on the role.
Thanks, Jess. Bridge, do you want to maybe say a few words?
Sure. It's an absolute privilege to add tertiary education to the suite of portfolios that I'll be responsible for under John Pesutto's leadership. It's a great privilege, and it will add to the skills and training portfolio because, of course, we know that under the Labor government there is a skills crisis. Skills Victoria itself has outlined that Victoria needs 370,000 more workers across teaching, education, construction, healthcare over the next couple of years, and there is absolutely no plan to deliver on this. So we'll be coming forwards with some positive plans, but also holding the Labor government to account for, on their watch, seeing this skills crisis.
Thanks, Bridge. Roma, do you want to?
Yes. Well, it's actually a great honour to be given the portfolio of child protection. It's a very complex and challenging portfolio. When we see these damning reports that have been coming out from the Commissioner with children being abused whilst in care, sexual abuse, groomed for criminal behaviour, we've seen a lot of inaction by this government, and our children are our future. So to have so many damning statistics of children being abused and so many gaps in the system where we can't get workers to fill the roles. So there's over 400 vacancies in people being able to work as case managers. There's 2,000 or more children who don't have a case manager who are vulnerable and need protection. These are damning figures, and the government has been inactive. I think it's actually also a shame that we see the Minister has got more responsibility. There can be nothing more important than children who are being abused, being cared for. So we should be seeing more support, not less.
Thanks, Roma. Cindy.
Thank you. The portfolio of work cover goes hand in hand with that of small business, and we've seen businesses across the board be absolutely whacked and treated so disrespectfully by this Labor government. The Treasurer said 42% on average increases. Well, let me tell you, everybody I've spoken to in this space has increases more likely 50 to 70%. It's really difficult for them to make ends meet. What does it mean? Pick up more of the load yourself, have to lay off staff, cut down hours that you're operating, cut down production. It's not a good story for businesses in Victoria. On top of that, we know that they're ripping $3 billion out of TAC. And what's going to go for that? Something has to go. We're paying for it as motorists, but something's got to give. Is it the police programs that they do around the state to try and keep our roads safer? Is it fixing those black spots? We know country roads are already neglected, and this is another dagger in the heart of people in country Victoria where they're going to continue to miss out because of Labor's waste and mismanagement.
Thanks, Cindy. We'll go Evan and then Matt and Dave.
Thanks, JP. Well, it's an absolute delight to take on the portfolio of housing affordability and home ownership from the great work that Jess Wilson has done, as well as Shadow Minister for Outer Suburban Growth. Housing, I remain absolutely passionate about helping the next generation of Australians and our migrant families achieve the great Australian dream. And the duty of government is to provide, at the end of it, to provide pass on a better state to what you found it. And on the housing front, we've seen this tired Labor government over and over again promise new housing. We saw in 2017 them promise about 6 or 7 new government sites developed into social housing units. And for most of them, they haven't even rezoned the land. So now this government expects us to believe, and the Victorian people to believe, it's going to be able to build 220 homes a day, every single day, including weekends for the next 10 years. It is absolutely unbelievable. And in my own electorate, I've been prosecuting this government for the botched delivery of growth areas like that of the suburb of Kalkaloo in my electorate, where residents are waiting over an hour just to get out of their own housing estate because the government hasn't invested in the infrastructure required. And we know when the government blows out and when the infrastructure budget blows out, as it has under this government, it's growth corridors that pay. And we saw that with the evolving promise or cancellation of the Wyndham Vale and Melton electrifications. We have established growth corridor suburbs that are still serviced by V-Line, which is what is meant to be a regional train. So this government has botched the delivery of growth areas, whether it be Kalkaloo, whether it be Point Cook, whether it be Melton, Werribee or Clyde. So I'll be prosecuting that case as part of your team, John.
Thank you, Evan. Hi. Well, my rail enthusiast father is going to be the happiest man in Victoria after me today, and probably my best advisor. There is so much to talk about on public transport, and I think as David and John have talked over the last few months about the suburban rail loop, which is really shaping the debate around public transport in this state, and the government that wants to spend $50 billion on one project, which really is the wrong priority. Think of what $50 billion can do for our public transport network across Victoria. It could duplicate the Bunyip River Bridge on the Gippsland line, which the government said they'd do in 2015 and haven't. It could upgrade the Northeastern line to have XPT and Velocity cars running at 160 k's an hour like they're designed to do, but never have. The XPTs have run at 160 on the New South Wales side since 1981. It could fix the Echuca line from Bendigo, which the current Premier said she'd do and didn't. Trains still run barely at 70 k's an hour on a country network. Or the other line coming out of Bendigo to Swan Hill, where trains run at barely 80 kilometres an hour on a main line. Money could go there, much less than $50 billion to fix up that line. Western Victoria, where we see the Geelong Fast Rail scrapped. The duplication from Geelong to South Geelong under the Heritage Tunnel could be in place, allowing for greater capacity. Roma will tell you about the velocities that still haven't arrived for Warrnambool services that want to replace all the diesel hauled sections. You know, there's so much that could be done, but the government's got the wrong priority. Wyndham Vale could be electrified. Melton could be electrified. We could be talking about electrification to Wallen, to Narnagoon. There's so much that could be done. Fixing the problems in the existing network, single track sections across the existing network, is something that we've talked about for a long time. You know, an airport rail link, which was meant to be the third stage of the SRL. The SRL, you know, it's their one and only priority, but there's so much more to do. That's why John wants to talk about the whole state. That's why in this portfolio, I'll certainly be talking about the whole state and taking the train as a matter of interest and love, not just out of the job. Fantastic, Matthew.
I think you can see from the team that JP's done a great job of the refresh, and this is all about ensuring that Victorians come first. Maddie spoke a lot about the waste and mismanagement under Jacinda Allen, and now she has the chequebook with more waste and more mismanagement. Victoria is broke and Victorians are paying the price, and that is why cost of living is a key element and something that I will be focused on right up until the election. We've got to be standing up for Victorians that are doing it tough at the moment. Victorians are struggling to put food on the table while this government wastes and mismanages money, and it's simply not good enough, whether it be high energy bills, whether it be the food at the supermarket, whether it be your basic transport costs. Everything that this government touches sends prices soaring. We've got to ensure that Victorians come first, and that is why cost of living will be a key priority in our time leading up to 2026.
Thanks, David. Any questions?
Can I ask Matthew?
Yeah, sure,
a question
absolutely.
first? That's right, Matthew.
Yeah.
So you return to the front bench. Do we take this as that you will remain as a front bencher and also a member for Bulleen until the 2026 state election?
Yes.
And will you rule out challenging for leadership again?
Yes.
Why did you want to be public transport minister?
You may wish to
Repeat everything.
you may wish to check my social media as part of that. I love it. My dad is a rail enthusiast. My dad built part of the put the interlocking lever frame down at the Williamstown Railway Museum. He's drawn track diagrams for all kinds of heritage groups. You know, we grew up being taken to bloody railway signal boxes. My brother and I got sick of it. My poor old mum's had 60 years of being railed. You know, my dad took her on their honeymoon to New South Wales. Their only picture is, you know, she's in the cab of a 38 class locomotive, which she's really angry about. But from 1968, that's their only picture. You know, it's in the blood. It's in the blood. And John said, "You want to do PT?" I said, "Well, yeah, why wouldn't I? I really like it. It's fascinating." And not more the point, there is so much to do, and it is state building, and it is state shaping, and our population is growing. And as John says correctly, you can't just grow Melbourne. You've got to look at the whole state. Throwing $50 billion into one project isn't about growing the whole state. So we've talked about priorities that are about growing the whole state. When I mentioned the Bunyip River Railway Bridge, it doesn't sound like much, but it's huge. When you ask Tim Bull and the National Party MPs and the Libs down there who get the train in, they'll tell you that the bottleneck's caused by one bridge in Longwarry, which this government have promised and promised and promised and promised. They don't do anything on. They promised a whole bunch of other infrastructure, which they haven't done. Now they're shelving it all, right? Because they have to save money for one project in Melbourne and go further than that. I've just come back from overseas, from Argentina. One of the things I looked at over there was a public transport network that has 3 rail gauges. 5'6" Spanish Iberian gauge, which is the above ground network, 3'3" and 3/8" metre gauge Andean gauge, which runs another part of the above ground network, the Subte, which is the underground network on standard gauge. They don't interact. Surprise, surprise. We don't have that problem on our metro network. And now we're about to build a suburban rail loop, which, surprise, surprise, in the year 2023 has a different track gauge. Why would you do that? Why would you have one line, not a network, one line that is different shaped rolling stock, different size, different track gauge, different overhead? Even if you were going to do it, why wouldn't you have it compatible with the current network? What kind of policy idiocy says build a line from one obscure location to another obscure location that has no interrelation with the current network? It doesn't make any sense. That's spending $50 billion on that when we could be fixing it. As John's a Gippsland boy, he'll tell you how important it is to the network in Traralgon and Bairnsdale about fixing that line. Priorities.
Do you now acknowledge, as Shadow Public Transport Minister, the Victorian people voted for the SRL twice? And
Our job...
this project will be built, even though you went to the last election promising...
Look, our job is to be a good and sensible opposition, and in tough economic times, saying $50 billion on one project, as David has said and as John has said, is the wrong priority. You've got to actually be able to pay for and put into priorities that build the whole state. One project at a time where our economy is falling apart. And the new Premier comes in who's a pale imitation of the person she's just replaced, right? And now she says, "Oh, it's all fine, everything's going rosy, I'll just change the deck chairs and everything's fine for it." That's no way to lead. We are talking, and John is talking about building the whole state. That's what we're focused on.
What do you think of Gav Williams as the new public transport minister?
I don't. I'll wait and see. But I know what I'll do, and that is I'll get the train out of love. I get the bus in just about most weeks into Parliament. I ride my bike into Parliament. I bet you most Labor Party ministers have it. Actually, Colin Brooks has. I saw him nearly come off one day. But he does, I do, and I do it out of interest, out of love, and I think it's the right thing to do.
Indeed. Okay, thank you very much.
Can I- sorry,
Oh,
I've got
jeez,
one.
I'm get away here.
There's no higher education minister. That portfolio has been taken away. What does that say about this priority?
It says that they don't understand the skills and workforce crisis that Victoria faces. And as Bridge said before, part of her responsibility is to focus on addressing that crisis, working in with other portfolio areas to make sure that if we're to meet the challenges, whether it's in public transport, whether it's in delivering better health services, whether it's in making sure that we have the teachers in our schools, primary, secondary, and in early childhood, we need a workforce. And that will come from skills, and it will come from our tertiary institutions. But a government that's ignoring that won't be able to deliver that outcome, and that's why we're focused on it. We understand the challenges, whether it's cost of living, whether it's making sure people can move around our state so that they can get to jobs easier, or they can be with their families more time in the day. Whatever it is, we're going to be focusing on the priorities of the Victorian people, and I just don't think the Premier and her ministry understand that whether it's residential construction or the other things I mentioned in health, education, child protection, you can't fix those problems unless you admit that there's a skills and workforce crisis, and I don't know how they're proposing to fix that if they don't recognise tertiary education as a specific priority itself.
John, you've been very critical of Danny Pearson. He's had one of the biggest wins taking over some huge infrastructure projects. What do you make of that?
Well, given the way Danny Pearson ran WorkCover, we know how this is going to end. Danny Pearson has spent more time focused on his share portfolio than his ministerial portfolio. Remember, this is the minister who to this day, in our view, is conflicted, has a conflict of interest with his commercial interests. Should have resigned months ago, and not resigning should have been sacked months ago. To be given a promotion, that just defies comprehension, and I think the Victorian people, I think if they didn't see it already, they can now see that not only has nothing changed with Daniel Andrews leaving, but in fact it's got worse. And people who are responsible for so many of the debacles Victoria now faces, with all of that, the people principally responsible are being rewarded. And whether that's Danny Pearson or Ben Carroll, who now has been put in charge of education. Remember, this is the minister who couldn't get the Mikey ticketing system right. Bungled that. We'll pay more for that. And what's he been put in charge of? He's been put in charge of our kids' education. So what we're seeing is the era of Daniel Andrews may have ended, but the Labor era will continue for the next 3 years. And what we're going to do as a refreshed team is we're just going to focus on the priorities. I don't believe any of these ministers with elevated responsibilities will do any better than they have in the past. And in fact, they've been given an opportunity to wreak havoc on other areas they haven't previously touched.
Why did you demote Anne-Marie Hermans?
Look, Anne-Marie remains in Shadow Cabinet and she's a valuable member of the team. And I can tell you she continues to make an active contribution to the discussions we have. So I look forward to continuing to work with her. Well, she's still in the Shadow Cabinet and she can still contribute at a very high level. In terms of South East, that's an area for us that's a high priority. We only have 2 seats in that region. Anne-Marie has a lot of work to do in that region, but I am keen to make sure that we don't lose her to those electoral priorities that she has, that she'll continue to make a contribution around the cabinet table, and I know she will.
When you say that the Labor Party is more of the same, but when you review your shadow cabinet, you've got Michael O'Brien, Matthew Guy, leaders from the past, how is it not more of the same from the Labor Party?
Oh, look, I'm really proud today and excited because what we've got is a blend of experience. No one can doubt. You've just seen how passionate and knowledgeable Matthew is on matters of public transport and also, you know, areas that he's focused on throughout his political career. Michael O'Brien's the same. He's served in the parliament a long time. People like David Hodgett and others who've been around have a lot of experience. They have a lot of knowledge. And that's something I greatly respect and I want around the cabinet table. We've also got, as you can see for yourselves, we've got some really exciting new talents coming in to Shadow Cabinet and with elevated responsibilities. So I've always believed that it's important to have a blend of new talent with experience and wisdom that comes with that. So I'm really, really excited by the team I've unveiled today. I'm very concerned about the team that the Labor government has unveiled today because not only is it more of the same, we can see that so many of the people who've bungled earlier projects and earlier programs have actually been promoted with all of the risk that comes with that and the additional damage that they could do in other areas of the government.
John, the machinery of government, it seems, isn't going to change too much, but there'll still be the same 10 departments, but with a few tweaks to what ministries are in each department. What do you make of that, and should there have been change in that respect in the public service?
Look, my main concern is not what labels they want to put on the public service. My biggest concern about the public service under Labor is the hopeless politicisation of the public service. So it doesn't really matter so much to us what names or what configurations they have. The concern is the Victorian people are paying the price of the politicisation of the public service because the public service isn't being allowed to do its job. Labor is politicising that public service, so it can't give the frank and fearless advice it needs. And it matters to Victorians because that's why you end up with hotel quarantine. That's why you end up with the suburban rail loop and the exorbitant costs that's going to impose on Victorian households. It's how you end up with major projects blowing out, how you end up with corruption report after corruption report. So it doesn't really matter so much what labels they want to attach, what configurations they want to adopt. It's still the same tired old incompetent Labor government politicising the public service.
Mr Davis has taken on Shadow Minister for the SEC. Why did you create a portfolio for a project you don't believe in?
That is about actually applying scrutiny. You see, we actually think the SEC is a hoax. It's a con, just like the Commonwealth Games was. Remember, the former Premier and the Premier herself looked you all in the eye. They looked the Victorian people in the eye and they made promises that they were going to deliver the Commonwealth Games. Here we are, more than a year after the Labor government promised the SEC. It still has no projects, still has no partners, still has no real funding. We're still not even any clearer on what he will actually do. Is it actually going to be in the business of generating renewable energy or transmitting renewable energy into businesses and households? Or is it just going to be an investment fund as a co-partner in project? We don't know because, frankly, the government doesn't know. So one of David's principal responsibilities with this new portfolio is to focus in on the SEC and expose it for the hoax it really is. But more importantly than that, David will be focusing on energy reliability and security and affordability for Victorian households. We're going through a big transition and this government has nothing to say. Even nearly a year after the last state election, it actually has no detail to provide you and the Victorian people with how it's going to transition on generation, what its plans are for transmission and scale storage. We're none the wiser on what its plans are. So David will present that alternative vision in the years ahead leading up to 2026. It's a big project, but I know David has the capacity to do that.
And just on the Matthew Bark's departure, I understand nominations closed today from the party for the Northeastern Metropolitan Region. Are you aware how many candidates ended up putting their names forward for that?
Not yet. I mean, I haven't had a chance to turn my mind to that, but we'll have a look when we get back.
Do you know whether that will go to a full convention, and when do you hope to have a new member? Well, I guess Matt transition out and a new member transition in.
Yeah, well, I think Matt's indicated that he'll go at the end of the year, if not early in the new year. The administrative committee of the party will set timetables for the pre-selection. I imagine it'll be a membership-driven pre-selection, as these things are, and we'll know more about the timetable in the coming days.
And in terms of Mulgrave, has the Liberal Party figured out how they'll get a candidate for that? And are you confident? You said last week that Michael Pietrino won't be the candidate. I guess how can you say that when it's really up to the members?
Well, it is, but I think there's a real appetite to maybe look at what other options there are with Mulgrave, and the party will make its decisions. I'm very respectful that needs to go to the administrative committee, but we're all keen to make sure that Victorians are always presented with a choice, and that wherever you are, we'll do our best to make sure you can get a Liberal how to vote card.
Can I just ask Mr Sapp
Yeah.
a question? Thank you. You're the spokesman for cost of living pressures. It has to be asked, as someone with 17 properties to your name, what lived experience do you bring to the role?
Oh, look, I mean, I think one of the things that we need to be doing is focused on people that work hard. Certainly need to ensure that, you know, that they're rewarded. And you know, I don't turn away from the fact that, you know, I had a life before politics. My focus is ensuring that every single Victorian is represented, and I will fight for every single Victorian like I always have. That's my focus. At the moment, Victoria is paying, you know, the highest prices for, whether it be their energy bills, whether it be, you know, in terms of property taxes, our debt. We're in a debt crisis at the moment. That's my focus, and that's what I'll be doing each and every day.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.